In 1987, Rocky Mountain Arsenal had become one of the most toxic sites in America. Until very recently, sarin had been manufactured here on an industrial scale. Then scientists proposed an idea that seemed completely absurd. They decided to bring back the animal on which nearly the entire local ecosystem depended, the black-tailed prairie dog. They were released first by the hundreds, then by the thousands, and something happened that nobody expected. The territory of the former chemical plant began drawing in species that had no business being there. First bald eagles, then black-footed ferrets, and eventually even bison. But in 2020, this seemingly revived ecosystem suddenly faced a new threat, a flea-borne plague outbreak. And that was only the beginning. The Army had tried to bury the problem deep underground. In 1961, they drilled a well 12,045 feet deep and began pumping toxic waste under pressure directly into crystalline bedrock. The Earth responded. Denver, a region with no history of seismic activity, experienced more than 1,500 tremors over the following years, including shocks reaching magnitude 5. The strongest came a year and a half after the injection was stopped. The supposed cause had been removed, but the shaking continued. In 1988, the Army tried something different, drying out the toxic sludge from the 93-acre Basin F containment pond in open air. The wind carried chemical vapors into residential neighborhoods of Commerce City. Residents reported nausea, headaches, and eye irritation en masse. When the state governor came personally to reassure the community, angry residents chased him down the street. 6 months later, the Army halted excavation and simply covered the sludge in place. By 1987, the EPA had placed Rocky Mountain Arsenal on the list of the country's most contaminated sites. More than 600 chemical compounds were identified in the soil and water. The official estimate for full remediation exceeded $2 billion. It was onto this land that Gober arrived to work in 1987. But the solution already existed on the very same territory. Nobody had simply had reason to look for it. For 40 years, the buffer zones surrounding the plant, thousands of acres, had been left untouched. No plowing, no construction, no entry permitted. While Denver expanded all around, prairie dog colonies in those buffer zones had kept on digging, grazing, building, on their own, with no plan or oversight. Prairie dogs dig burrows that channel water into the ground rather than letting it run off hard surface. They clip the grass short, maintaining clear sight lines for watching predators, and in doing so create a specific type of vegetation, protein-rich, which draws entirely different animals than tall weeds would. Instead of the uniform scrub that typically takes over disturbed land, their grazing produced a mosaic, closely cropped, nutrient-rich grass right alongside bare soil, with taller shrubs at the edges. This type of habitat had not existed in this stretch of the plains for decades. Animals and birds not seen here in generations began returning almost immediately. Abandoned prairie dog burrows became a separate kind of real estate for another species. Burrowing owls cannot dig their own burrows. They are entirely dependent on those dug by others. Each April, the owls migrate to the refuge and move into empty burrow entrances in the prairie dog colonies, raising their young underground in tunnels built by a completely different species. The owls abandon a site if the surrounding grass grows too tall. They need the same short-cropped sightline that prairie dog grazing creates. Without an active colony, the owls simply have nowhere to settle. The same ferruginous hawk that Gober watched hovering over a burrow in 1987 still hunts this territory today. The refuge is considered one of the best spots near Denver for observing this particular predator. The reason is the same as it was then: the concentration of prairie dogs as prey. No decision was ever made to restore this land. The colonies simply kept doing what they had always done. And over 40 years of enforced isolation, that turned out to be the solution. Relocating prairie dogs away from contaminated zones became a permanent, ongoing job for the service, not a one-time action, but a process that has continued for decades and goes on today. Each colony on the territory was given GIS coordinates, and the sites were divided into numbered capture zones. Animals were trapped alive using bait made of 3-part livestock feed. then transported on all-terrain vehicles to the northwestern part of the refuge, well away from the sealed toxic zones still managed by the Army. In the 2010 fiscal year alone, 1,008 individuals were caught and relocated. In 1986, a year before Gober arrived, biologists conducting routine winter monitoring came across something that had no business being there: a communal roost of roughly 80 bald eagles, a species then under federal protection as endangered. A full survey finds not just eagles, but more than 330 plant and animal species living on land the military had written off as dead. Organizations press Congress, and in 1992, President George H.W. Bush signs legislation creating the refuge, while the site is still being cleaned up from nerve agent. The irony is hard to miss. The same organochlorine pesticides manufactured here for years had been decimating bald eagle populations across America. The toxic plant ended up sheltering the very species it had nearly destroyed. Today, a permanent pair nests on the territory year-round. In winter, they are joined by dozens of migrants from the north, roosting in the same trees where their predecessors gathered in 1986. The arsenal got its final resident thanks to an event 500 miles to the north in Wyoming. On September 26, 1981, around 3 in the morning, farmers John and Lucille Hogg are woken by the barking of their dog Shep outside the bedroom window, decide he's tangled with a porcupine, and go back to sleep. In the morning, John finds the carcass of an unfamiliar animal with a black mask on its face and a broken back. Lucille suggests having it mounted. The taxidermist recognizes the carcass as a black-footed ferret, a species considered completely extinct in the wild at that point. Biologists Dean Biggins and Steve Martin travel to the ranch, find a colony of roughly 120 ferrets on a neighboring property, the last known population of the species on Earth. Within a few years, plague and canine distemper wipe the colony nearly to zero, and in 1987, the service is forced to capture all remaining animals: 18 individuals, 7 males and 11 females. Every black-footed ferret alive today descends from that group. While the ferrets multiplied in captivity, the arsenal was being prepared for their return, and the main enemy turned out not to be predators but fleas. Plague in the prairie dog colonies had been documented since the mid-1970s, with outbreaks killing 95 to 99% of affected animals. The service worked through insecticide after insecticide, carbaryl, permethrin, deltamethrin, dusting burrows by hand, but fleas gradually developed resistance to each one. In parallel, the service tested an oral plague vaccine hidden in peanut butter-flavored bait laced with rhodamine B, a fluorescent dye that accumulated in a rodent's fur after ingestion. A UV light was enough to see who had eaten it and who hadn't. Drones dropped bait in remote locations. At Rocky Mountain Arsenal, drones are prohibited due to the adjacent Denver International Airport, so bait was spread from an ATV-mounted device that covered 60 acres an hour instead of 6 on foot. The ferrets themselves were put through something resembling a training camp before release. At least 30 days in open enclosures with natural burrows and live prairie dogs, under wire netting that protected the young ferrets from predators while they learned to hunt on their own. Each was vaccinated against distemper and plague before release. Each of them would go on to eat between 100 and 150 prairie dogs per year. The black-footed ferret physically cannot survive on any other food. On the afternoon of October 5th, 2015, several dozen journalists and biologists stand around a prairie dog burrow, watching a portable carrier in the grass. Nick Kazor, then the refuge's deputy manager, had been running preparations for 2 years. Colonies had been dusted against fleas well in advance to clear 1,300 acres in the northeastern part of the refuge for the release. That day, around 30 ferrets were let out of the carriers. Kazor would later describe it as one of the best feelings of a biologist's career. Watching a species that shouldn't exist return to the wild. After release, the ferrets continued to be tracked at night by spotlight, looking for the characteristic emerald eye shine, and over each burrow where an animal had retreated, a reader was passed over the microchip implanted under the skin before release. But the system remained fragile. In July 2019, the service was notified of a dozen dead prairie dogs, and laboratory analysis confirmed plague. The refuge, which normally closes only 3 times a year, was shut to visitors for more than a week. A team under David Lucas shifted to 16-hour shifts, treating every burrow with insecticide within a 13-mile radius and dusting 11 miles of trails for 15 feet on either side. 54 ferrets living on the refuge at the time, entirely dependent on prairie dogs as their only food source, were under threat. The service was preparing a contingency plan in case the ferrets had to be recaptured and moved to another site. Lucas would later say it simply, "It's an adaptive process. There is no ready-made plan." The bison herd that started with 16 animals in 2007 had grown to 87 by 2013, and managers had to reduce it to 60 because the 2,500 acres of restored prairie couldn't yet sustain that level of grazing. Twice a year, dozens of wildlife biologists and managers from across the country converge on the refuge for the roundup to check the animals for disease, assess genetic diversity, and select some for transfer to other reserves. Refuge Director David Lucas, who personally opens the corral gates and drives the truck during these roundups, told journalists simply, "The herd reached the right size faster than anyone had projected." By 2018, the ferret population at the refuge had grown to approximately 90 individuals, the second largest population of the species in the world. Today, the refuge covers nearly 16,000 acres, one of the largest urban wildlife refuges in the country. More than 330 plant and animal species have been documented here. Total remediation costs came to $2.1 billion. 917 acres of the former plant zone were sold to Commerce City, a school, a community center, a professional soccer stadium, and hundreds of acres of parks now stand there. In autumn, coyotes hunt at the edges of prairie dog colonies, camouflaged in the russet grass. In winter, bison tracks in the snow cross the tracks of the same predators that crowded around a burrow in 1987, when Gober had just arrived at the site. In May 2011, the refuge opened its first public visitor center. That year, 23,000 people came. 2 years later, 180,000. Within a few more years, 450,000. In 2018, the site received the ASLA Landmark Award for maintaining landscape integrity over 15-plus years. The land that once triggered more than 1,500 earthquakes now draws more visitors annually than it ever saw during its entire military history. This is not a story with a tidy ending. The plague still circulates in the prairie dog colonies. In 2020, it broke through and wiped out most of the ferret population built since 2015, and the service had to start over. 2 sealed waste sites sit underground, not destroyed, just buried. The Army still pumps contaminated groundwater and will for decades more. The refuge never reaches complete, only under permanent management, a difference invisible to anyone watching bison cross the prairie. The herd has grown from 16 animals to roughly 250. New fencing will open nearly 10,300 acres to them. Since 2021, Native Nation representatives have joined the annual roundup as full participants. In 2025, Denver's mayor proposed a cultural embassy for indigenous peoples on the refuge grounds. The director's goal is simple: make this the best place in the country to see what restoration actually looks like.